And to tell us more about what's been making headlines in finance and economic news this week, we're talking with Suzanne Haddan, Managing Director of BFG Financial Services. A very good morning to you. Good to have you along.
Yeah, good morning to both of you.
Tell us, what have we been seeing, particularly from the US in relation to the Australian market this week?
We've had a pretty good week, notwithstanding last night's performance. And I think that's surprising, but overall, people are being a bit more optimistic about the trade talks. They think USA and China might come to some agreement, which is great. I would say, though, that if you're overweight in shares, I think that would have been a good week to reassess your situation.
Right, to shed some shares.
I would think so, because we still expect a lot of volatility to stay in the market, and there's lots of headwinds with economic growth. The World Bank has reduced what they think the GDP around the world will be, so there's quite a few issues.
Now, this week we had that news about the proposed shake-up to the superannuation, the compulsory super system. What did you make of those proposals?
Well, there was over 30 proposals, and I must say most of them I was pretty keen on. What I'm more concerned about is that it gets swept under the mat and they compromise like they did in the last round of changes, and we end up with another Royal Commission, which would be disastrous. There's a couple of very interesting ones. The first one is the multiple accounts. With the extra insurance people have and paying extra admin fees, it's costing about $2.6 billion. So I think that's a piece of legislation that's already in front of the Parliament that needs to happen, because young people end up with multiple accounts, multiple insurance policies that either aren't suitable, they can't claim on, they don't need, and they're paying for it, which affects their long-term balances. Ridiculous.
One of the other recommendations was that there should be a top 10 list, if you will. There's been a lot of commentary this week about who decides that. We know that the proposal is for a panel that's appointed by a panel of experts. But how subjective would that be, and how fit for purpose would that be if we all have different requirements for our superannuation?
Dan, that's a very important point. While fundamentally I think we need some system to alert the first-time workers where they should be going for their super, the problem is, how are they going to determine which products go on the list? For example, you could have a product that does very well with their performance, but their insurance is not very good. And so you win on interest, but you lose on paying for extra insurance. Or it might be great insurance for a professional white-collar male, but very poor insurance for a blue-collar female worker. So that's the first problem. The other one is that you could mislead the public by saying, wow, they perform really well with their balanced portfolio, which may or may not be balanced, yet there are other areas they did very poorly on, and consumers might think, oh, I should use that fund no matter which fund I select. The other thing is, what happens when someone comes off the list? So you've started work and you've been put into this U-Butte fund, and then it drops off the list and becomes an underperforming fund. Who tells that person that they're now in an underperforming fund? So I think rather than a top 10, it should be an extensive list. It might have 20, might have 2, might have 35, but based on a set of criteria that if you meet this criteria, you're on the list.
So is there more that would give an explanation of this is why you're here and this is what the different parameters of that would be?
Yes, exactly, Dan. Group the funds to, in your situation, we think this is the best one that we can come up with you. It's very problematic. So I wish them all the very best of luck, but I'm very concerned a fund comes off the list, money will come out of that fund. They'll have to sell assets. What if it's a low time? What about taxation consequences? So I don't want to be a naysayer, but it's problematic.
Another concern with the top 10 list was that it would potentially reduce competition. Do you think that's a legitimate concern?
Oh, Johanna, I think that's very valid, because it becomes an easy way for the unengaged to just look at that list and then not look at their super again. And what will happen is, I think there will be more merging, which the Productivity Commission wants, but you want to have a robust competitive system, and it can bring everybody to doing the same thing to get on the list. You don't want people gaming the list, where they do things so that they give you less services because there's less cost to get on the list.
Although, isn't this designed to help those people who aren't so engaged, who might have those multiple super accounts and haven't got around to compiling them all together, and who also, the people who might be on a really underperforming fund, and doesn't that help them to sort of get in this top 10 list and get more money?
It only actually helps you if you're unengaged, if you're one of the young two-thirds of workers who are getting a default fund. How are you going to alert the ones who are already in the system? Because if they're unengaged, they're probably not going to follow the list closely, so they could stay in underperforming funds. I mean, consistently underperforming funds should be addressed in other ways, and the Productivity Commission report was very clear on that, so there's another great positive from that report for sure.
What's clear from that report and this entire discussion is that we've still got an enormous amount of work to do when you consider that if you're coming into the workforce now, by simple changes could mean that you would have $500,000 or so more at retirement time, and that if you're older you could have upwards of 80,000. Are we getting the system right, and is this the right measure, or do we need political leadership in a bipartisan way?
We need bipartisan, and that's going to be a big challenge because we don't get it on much. Yeah. And the other thing is the system is cracked, not broken. But it's more about performance, because we've spoken before about contributing for low-income earners using the current rules for co-contribution. That can improve your super fund by $80,000. So there's other elements that we need to make sure super funds address for the members, besides that just trying to keep fees low and increase returns.
In other finance news this week, we had retail sales better than expected. What was behind that?
Well, yes, it was 0.4%, which was up from the 0.3% that was expected. There's a lot of talk in November that it was more about bringing forward sales from Christmas, because you're almost embarrassed to say if you paid full price for something, aren't you?
I know, that's right. You can't help but see all the sales signs around the street.
They were absolutely everywhere, but we've got the wealth effect too. What happens is if you feel poorer because your property prices are dropping, your super's not doing well, you're not getting a wage rise, you feel poorer, you feel sentiment drops and you spend less, and that might happen in Christmas.
And it was also to do with those big sort of super sale days, like
they were unbelievable.
Cyber Monday and...
Yes, and the banks have been checking their credit card records, and they have alerted us before official statistics that looks like sales are down in December and January. So we're still looking at a bit of, can we say, lacklustre consumer spending.
And you mentioned there about property and how that can start a spiral down or up, depending on what the circumstances. This week we saw reports that rental prices continue to drop in Sydney. They're going up in Canberra. I was in... I know.
I know. Does your head in, doesn't it?
That's right. I was in Darwin last week, and some properties that I saw there were $800,000 a couple of months ago are now listed for $400,000 and $500,000. What sort of indication is the big shifts across the board in different directions in the property market having?
Yeah. So the majority of properties seem to be dropping in value. Again, that's going to affect sentiment. So it's going to affect what we spend. It's not an issue if you don't have to sell, and it's a fabulous issue if you're buying for the first time, isn't it?
Wanting to get your foot into the market.
So this is, in some respects, a great outcome. But what if you have to sell and you've got high debt at that point in time? People could actually be losing wealth and some people go bankrupt, and there is evidence of increasing mortgage stress. You saw last week more banks and institutions increasing their home loans outside of the government, the Reserve Bank increasing or decreasing rates. Could we see a decrease in rates from the Reserve Bank?
It's good or bad news, depending on what position you're in.
Exactly.
Suzanne, we'll leave it there. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.